Peppa Pig, tap, tap, tap. It started with a faint sound. One night, Peppa woke up to a soft tap, tap, tap. She sat up on her pillow, listened. Silence. Wind outside, rustling trees. Nothing strange. But as soon as she lay back down, tap, tap, tap. 3 short knocks, steady, as if someone tapped on the window. Probably my imagination, she whispered to herself. She forgot about it the next morning. The day went on as usual. George played, the parents laughed, everything felt calm. But at night, it happened again. Tap, 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 exactly at 2:13 a.m. On the third night, Peppa couldn't resist. She walked to the window and peered into the darkness. Nothing, no one, just the garden, swallowed in fog. She turned away and noticed, on the inside of the glass, hoof prints, as if someone had tapped from within. "George?" she whispered, but George was fast asleep. She checked. He hadn't moved. On the fourth night, Peppa stayed awake. Wrapped in a blanket, she sat watching the window. 2:13 a.m. Tap, tap, tap. Her heart clenched. She crawled closer, and for just a moment, it looked like someone was in the window's reflection. A figure, tall, thin, standing right behind the glass. But outside, there was no one. She shut the curtain and hid under the blanket. Didn't sleep until morning. In the daylight, everything seemed normal again. The marks on the glass had vanished. No one believed her. Daddy Pig said, "Just a draft." Mummy Pig smiled. Maybe it was a dream? Even George only shrugged. On the fifth night, she decided to write everything down. She opened a notebook, sat on the bed. 2:13 a.m. Tap, tap, tap. She jumped up and pulled open the curtain. Nothing, but in the reflection, her room, and another Peppa inside, standing by the bed, staring straight at the window. Was that the real one? Was she outside or inside? For a second, she didn't know who was who. She shut her eyes, counted to 10, opened them. The room was the same, but the glass, there was a word on it. "Let me in," drawn with a finger, from inside, on the misty glass. Peppa screamed and ran to her parents' room, but it was empty. No one. The beds weren't even made, as if no one had ever slept there. The hallway, dark, from her room, light, and a shadow approaching the window. Peppa stepped back, then heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Not on the window now, on her bedroom door, and a voice, just like hers. "Peppa, you promised to let me in." Peppa Pig, the quiet room. It all started with a whisper. "Daddy, what's that door?" Peppa asked when she noticed it at the end of the hallway. Small, pale blue, with a faded plaque and no name. It hadn't been there before. A door? Daddy Pig scratched his head. Probably a closet. I never noticed it. But the door wouldn't open. No handle, no lock. Just a faint draft seeping from underneath. The next day, the door stood wide open, as if it had been waiting. Peppa carefully peeked inside. The room was completely empty. White walls, dusty floor, no furniture, no windows, and no sound at all, not even her own breathing. "Hello," she said. But there was no sound. None. No echo, no noise. Her voice vanished. Then Mummy Pig stepped in, tried to say, "What did you find, Peppa?" But nothing came out. Her lips moved, but the silence was like concrete. Daddy Pig clapped his hooves. Still nothing. Even footsteps made no sound in there. They started calling it the quiet room and decided to stay away from it. But George, on the third day, he disappeared. Daddy Pig searched the whole house. Peppa peeked into the quiet room and saw his hooves. He was standing in the corner, silent, still, not turning around. She ran to him and shouted, "George, let's go!" And he vanished right in front of her eyes, as if he had dissolved. She tried to tell her parents, but no one believed her. The door slammed shut and wouldn't open again. The next morning, it was ajar. Inside, a dusty floor, and in the dust, 2 sets of hoof prints leading to the corner, but none leading back. Peppa took a notebook and pen, stepped inside, laid the notebook down, wrote, "Is there no way out?" The pen left no marks, as if anything connected to speech just disappeared. She stepped out. Silence rang in her ears. On the 3rd day, she decided something had to be done. She entered the room, closed the door behind her, and then she heard it. Not a voice, a muffled moan. In the corner sat someone else, too tall, too thin, with a long face. It didn't move, but its eyes slowly blinked. Peppa clasped both hooves over her mouth, tried not to breathe, and then the figure turned its head, slowly, exactly. Peppa bolted from the room. Since then, she kept the door locked, taped shut. But every night, she heard heavy breathing behind it. And each morning, a message appeared on the wall near the door. You spoke. Peppa Pig. The second window. Peppa's room had always had one window. Everyone knew that. Peppa, Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, even George. From that window, she could see their yard, the swing, the flower bed. Everything was normal. But one morning, Peppa woke up and felt an unusual chill. She yawned, stretched, sat up in bed, and froze. On the other wall, there was a window, a second one. It had never been there before. Peppa jumped out of bed and walked up to it. It was narrower and taller than her usual window. The frame was dark, old, the glass cloudy like it had a layer of dust. Beyond it was a forest. Not their yard, not the street, a forest. Tall grey trees without leaves. A pale sky. Mist curling between the trunks. Peppa backed away. She looked through her usual window. There was their yard. George was playing with his dinosaur. Everything as it should be. She turned back to the second window. The forest. Still. But it felt like someone was hiding behind the trees, watching. "Mummy?" she called. Mummy Pig came up the stairs and entered the room. "Yes, Peppa? I have a window." "Of course you have a window," Mummy smiled. "Everything's fine." "No, not that one. Another one. There's a forest." Mummy looked where Peppa pointed. "There's a wall, sweetie," she said. "You probably had a dream. Try to sleep a little more." And she left. Peppa stayed alone. The window was still there. During the day, she tried to forget, played with George, drew pictures. But when she returned to her room in the evening, the window had moved lower, almost level with her eyes. The forest was the same, but the mist was thicker, and there was a figure among the trees, black, still. The face was unclear. Peppa pulled the curtain shut, tight, and stayed away. At night, she woke up. The curtain had been pushed aside. A pale light shone from the window, and Peppa saw the figure had moved closer. It was now standing right at the glass. It didn't move, but now she could see the face. It looked like her, just stretched, eyes too wide, a thin, strange smile. Peppa screamed. Mummy ran in. The light came on. The window was gone. "You had another dream, darling," said Mummy. "Everything's all right." But Peppa didn't believe her. The next morning, the window was back, on a different wall. Every day it changed position, sometimes behind the bed, sometimes beside the door. The forest never changed. The figure kept getting closer. Peppa started leaving notes on the windowsill. "Who are you?" she wrote. But in the morning, they'd be gone. And one morning, words had been scratched into the glass from the inside. "You look out the window, but I'm inside." That day, Peppa didn't go to school. She sat in the corner of her room, by her normal window, breathing quietly. From behind her, a rustle. The curtain moved on its own. She didn't turn around. Now, the window is always there. But no one else sees it. Not Mummy, not Daddy. Even George says there's nothing there. And sometimes, at night, it opens. Peppa Pig. The stranger. A new resident had come to town. No one knew where he came from. He simply appeared. A tall, white wolf with a long snout and a calm, too-straight stare. He didn't smile, didn't speak. He only nodded when someone greeted him. Mummy Pig said he had bought the house on the edge of town. "He doesn't have anyone," she added. "Probably just wants peace and quiet." Daddy Pig nodded, but he seemed uneasy ever since. Peppa first saw the wolf near the shop. He stood still by the window, not looking at the products, but at his own reflection. She waved. He slowly turned his head and nodded. Slowly. His eyes didn't blink. After that, she started noticing him more often. At the bus stop, even though no buses came there. On the forest path. Sometimes walking down the street, but with no sound of footsteps. Then the nights began. The first night, Peppa woke up suddenly. She didn't know why. Just opened her eyes and looked at the wall. Everything was silent, but the room felt occupied. George was asleep beside her. The door was shut, the window dark. She thought it was just a dream. The second night, she woke again. A cold feeling washed over her. At first, silence. Then, breathing. Very soft, like someone was behind her. Peppa froze, turned. No one there. But in the morning, she noticed, the curtains were slightly open, even though Mummy always shut them tight. On the third night, she saw him. He stood in the corner of her room, the white wolf, tall. The moon's shadow passed through him, but his outline was clear. Eyes, black, lifeless. He didn't move, just stared, silently. Peppa screamed. Mummy and Daddy rushed in, but the room was empty. Mummy said, "It was just a dream." Daddy hugged her tightly, but his face was pale. He understood something, but said nothing. Peppa no longer slept alone, but that didn't help. On the fourth night, George woke her. He stood by the window, pointing outside. There, in the edge of the fog, near the street lamp, stood the wolf. His face couldn't be seen, just the silhouette, motionless. Peppa gripped George's hoof. From that night on, he came every night, and each night felt longer. Daddy Pig began locking the doors. Mummy shut every window. They stopped talking about it, just glanced over their shoulders. On the sixth night, Peppa woke and realized she couldn't move. George was asleep. The nightlight flickered, and in the doorway stood a figure, white, tall. He tilted his head. Slowly, he whispered, but there were no words, only sound, like the wind whispering through ears. Peppa woke up in tears, but the footprints on the floor remained. On the seventh day, Daddy was gone. He had gone out for bread and never returned. On the kitchen table lay a note. He didn't leave. He's just with him now. Peppa didn't know who wrote it. Mummy just held her close. Since that night, they never turn off the lights. But someday, it'll turn on in her room anyway, and Peppa knows he won't leave until he takes someone else. Peppa Pig, the box of drawings. It started on a quiet morning. Peppa woke up to a rustling sound. George was dragging something along the floor. In the hallway, she saw him carrying a cardboard box. Old, dusty, no writing on it. It looked like something forgotten in a basement. "Where did you get that?" Peppa asked. George didn't answer. He just smiled. He placed the box on the floor and opened it. Inside were drawings, dozens, some on torn scraps of paper, others fresh and colorful, all drawn by a child's hoof. "Did you draw these?" George stayed silent. The first drawing was simple. Peppa standing in the kitchen, a broken cup on the floor, Daddy with a broom, Mummy holding a rag. A few hours later, it happened, exactly like in the drawing, down to the smallest detail. Peppa dropped a cup, shards scattered. Daddy sighed. Mummy got the rag. "Just a coincidence," Mummy said. But George pulled out the next drawing. It showed their garden, a ball stuck in the tree, Daddy holding a ladder, Peppa reaching up. The next day, the ball really did get stuck in the same place, exactly like the drawing. Peppa started going through the drawings. The further she went, the darker they became. The colors, duller. The figures, twisted. One showed Peppa's room at night. At the window, a silhouette. Faceless. Peppa shoved it to the bottom of the box. But that night she woke up, went to the window. For a moment, she thought someone had just stepped out of view. Another drawing, the bathroom, the mirror, Peppa's reflection smiling, even though she wasn't. Another one, George sleeping, and beside his bed stood a second George, identical, but with red crayon eyes. Peppa hid the box in the closet, but George found it again. He said, "I have to keep watching." Every day, new drawings appeared, even though no one was drawing. One morning, at the very top of the pile, was a picture of that exact breakfast. The tablecloth, the cup, the toast, all correct. At the edge, a drop. Peppa thought it was paint, but it was tea. Then came a drawing of the living room. Daddy asleep in his chair, and behind him, someone reaching toward his shoulder. That evening, Daddy flinched. He said, "I thought someone touched me." But the room was empty. At last, Peppa found the final drawing. It was black and white. It showed herself, standing alone in an empty room. No windows, no toys. Her face, blank. Arms limp at her sides, and behind her, the box. And written in neat handwriting, "Now you're inside." That night, Peppa woke up. The room felt unusually dark, too quiet. On the floor, the box, empty. All the drawings were gone. Only one remained. It lay on top. It showed Mummy, Daddy, and George sitting at the table, smiling, laughing. But Peppa wasn't there, and at the bottom, written carefully, "They don't remember you anymore."